Old People's Home for 4-year-olds in an hour. First Channel 4 has asked people across the UK their views on Brexit. Tonight we discover Brexit, what the nation really thinks.
Has the United Kingdom changed its mind about Brexit? Is the country as divided as ever? Are you sick of politicians claiming to know what the country voted for back in 2016 or what it wants now? Tonight, hard Brexit, soft Brexit, slow Brexit or no Brexit? We discover what the nation really thinks. Good evening from Birmingham, a city where Leave won, but by the smallest of margins in the 2016 referendum. Now, Channel 4 has conducted the biggest and deepest independent survey on Brexit with the polling company Survation, asking over 20,000 people drawn from every constituency across the nations of the United Kingdom. In the next hour, we'll reveal what the UK thinks of Brexit and the likely outcome of a new referendum were it held today. We're joined by an audience from across the region, evenly split between Leavers and Remainers, and a few who don't know. I'll be speaking to key players, the Justice Secretary, David Gauke, who will be in Cabinet with Theresa May tomorrow, and Barry Gardiner, who, if Labour were in power, would be leading trade negotiations. Now, as individuals, they both voted to remain, but their parties, the only two who have any chance of negotiating Brexit, are both now committed to leaving the EU. Of course, new cross-party Brexit campaigns have sprung up since the referendum on either side, both furious with the government and Labour. Caroline Lucas supports a people's vote, a chance for the UK to think again. And Nigel Farage is back, out campaigning for Leave means leave. Now, what we want to find out tonight is, 2 years on, are people unchanged in their views or beginning to think afresh? Rick, have you changed your mind?
I have, yes. The vote was tight, but it was a surprise to those of us who voted to remain the first time round. But the people want to leave, so I'm on board with that. Let's get behind it. Let's get the best deal we can.
Shirley, how about you?
I voted Leave originally. I still vote Leave. I've analysed all the different facets that have been going on.
But is it clear to you?
I don't think it's really going to be clear to anybody until a potential decision is made that we can actually work with. At the moment, I would still vote Leave again.
Amanda, I mean, did you hear people saying they've changed their minds?
Not very many. The odd person. I've met two that voted Leave that are now thinking again, but I just think this is a complete omni-shambles, if I'm honest.
And so you're firmer than ever?
Personally,
in your own opinion?
I voted Remain, but I've accepted the Leave decision. I think the referendum should never have happened in the first place. It was a vanity project.
Do you think Britain's changed its mind? Any of you? Not sure. Well, we will find out. Now, on the night of June the 23rd, 2016, the first indicator that a political earthquake was about to hit Britain was the referendum result from Sunderland. Now, Sunderland voted Leave by 61% to 39% that night. So what does our survey suggest they feel now? It's shifted a lot by 10 points. Now it's 49% Remain and 51% Leave. So still a majority for Leave, but much, much tighter now, only a couple of percent in it. Now we'll bring you results from other areas and reveal what the UK as a whole thinks later on in the programme. But Sir John Curtis, familiar face, is head of the UK Polling Council, and he's always on those election night programmes and the referendum night programmes. You were there when the Sunderland result came in and everybody went, oh my goodness.
Yeah,
what does that mean?
It wasn't a surprise that Sunderland voted Leave. Everybody expected Sunderland to vote Leave, frankly, even if the country had voted narrowly to Remain. The surprise was the size of the margin. That margin suggested, if the rest of the country was going to follow Sunderland, that perhaps Leave had narrowly won it. Now, of course, what we now see here is a big swing back. The question that faces us in the next hour, is that equally indicative of what the rest of the country thinks, Or perhaps has our survey revealed that this time at least Sunderland has swung rather differently from the rest of the country?
If you'd have seen that result back in 2016, what would you have said will happen?
Back in 2016, if we'd seen 59-51 in Sunderland, we would have been thinking that probably Remain were home and dry. But of course, there's always variation, so we could by no means have been sure simply on that evidence alone.
A lot of scepticism about opinion polls these days. Tell us about this one and what has been done to it, to the numbers, to make it reliable.
Yeah, there are two things about this poll that are crucial. The first is the size. This is the biggest poll to be commissioned by a non-partisan organisation since the EU referendum. And because of its size, we can tell you much more about both who is now inclined to vote Leave and Remain, because we have lots of people in the various demographic and political groups, but also crucially, as we've just illustrated, we can also give you an idea of how each local authority voted. We can, in a sense, replicate the referendum account of 2016. We have sufficient people that the data have been analysed and modelled so that we can come up with an estimate for everywhere of how we think the country might vote if we were to have another referendum.
Sir John Curtis, thank you. Nigel Farage, that comes up 49-51. Sweaty seat of the pants time?
2 points to make. First, the sample size is tiny. It may be big nationally, but within Sunderland, it's fewer than 200 people. And I would not take any poll seriously that wasn't at least 1,000 people per constituency, point one. Point two...
I mean, you can dismiss the poll, but it is the biggest one since the referendum.
Well, nationally, yes, but not... If I wanted to see what Sunderland thought, there'd be at least 1,000 people in Sunderland. Second point is this. People respond to campaigning. You know, the reason at election time that we knock on doors and deliver leaflets and do things is people respond to it. What we've been through now for the last 6-9 months is a Remain campaign, very heavily funded, very active, out there everyday campaigning, out with their street stalls. And frankly, the big problem that the Leave campaigners had, and okay, we've tried with Leave Means Leave to get it going again, is we thought we'd won, well, we had won, we thought the general election was the second vote in favour of Leave, and we've not been out there.
Okay.
So I would expect across the country to see a move back in the other direction, but not of that scale.
Caroline Lucas, are you cheered by this? I mean, how big does the move need to be to deliver your people's vote or to stop the whole thing?
Well, I think this is a very positive vote coming from Sunderland. You know, as John Curtis said, it was a place that had such a big majority in favour of Leave before. The fact that we're now pretty much neck and neck, I think, is pretty positive. And it's interesting to hear Nigel, you know, trying to find reasons for why this is happening. But I can tell you why it's happening.
He's got a point, hasn't he? I mean, he's got a full-on campaign.
I think it was Amanda over there who basically called what's happening from the government omni-shambles. It is an omni-shambles. I don't blame Theresa May. She's basically been held hostage by the zealots in her own government who want to have this very ideological extreme Brexit. She is being given a position that is impossible to square. So she's being told that we've got to leave the single market and the customs union, but not have a hard border in Ireland. Now, those two things are impossible to resolve, and that's why it's so important that it goes back to the people, that we have a people's vote on the final outcome so we can see what people really think.
Well, you take us very well then to what we wanted to have a look at next, because the government are currently still in negotiations with the EU about what they want from a deal. If you believe them, 95% of it's been agreed. But what is it that the public want? We asked the nation what were the key things that they did or did not want to see in a final deal. Now, we asked whether, after Brexit, people would be happy with a deal which limits the UK's ability to make trade deals with countries outside the EU, something that you cannot do and remain in the customs union. Now, only 19% agree with that, while 62% disagree. So there is very strong support for the idea of Britain being able to do its own trade deals. One red line the government have always insisted on has been an end to freedom of movement. Immigration, they think, was a key driver for Brexit. But what do the people think now? We asked whether after Brexit, UK and EU citizens who wish to do so should be able to live and work in each other's countries. And this one's a surprise. 63% agree with that. That's 63% of people effectively agreeing with freedom of movement after Brexit. 20% disagree. That's people that is people. The
That's
question,
comical, but really.
the question that was asked was if people
I can see what
want
the question
to.
is.
So you can
mention
dismiss
free
it if
movement,
you
did
like,
you?
but let's look
Dear
at both those areas. First, people clearly want a degree of freedom of movement, according to that poll, and that's what neither of you are offering at the moment. David Gork, you surprised by that number?
Yes, I am, and that doesn't reflect the opinions that you get on the doorstep, talking to members of the public. And I speak as someone who, as you mentioned, campaigned, voted to remain. But it seemed to me in 2016 a very strong message from the British public was that freedom of movement was something that they wanted to address. And I think even a number of people who voted Remain felt that the way freedom of movement was working was not what they wanted. So well, I'm very surprised
Barry
by
Gardner,
that.
could it be something to do with the way you ask a question?
Yeah.
If you ask people, would you think we should all be able to live and work in each other's countries across Europe? They like the idea of that. If you talk about immigrants having free movement into Britain, then they don't.
Well, look, I'm heartened by the response, but what we've always said is that what you should do is you should set your immigration policy to meet the needs of your economy. The mistake the government has always made is to set their economic policy to meet arbitrary immigration targets.
But you want to end freedom of movement, don't you?
Freedom of movement ends when you leave the EU. And what we've said is we want to have an immigration policy that is for the benefit of jobs, for the benefit of our economy. Now, the problem that the government has got is they promised a white paper on this 18 months ago. They still haven't delivered it. And what David needs to be able to answer is, by the 29th of March next year, will we actually have a new Immigration Act setting out what the rules are? Because the immigration minister came before the select committee last week and she didn't know, and the department had to contradict her afterwards.
In terms of the migration position we will have, it depends on whether we reach a deal or not. The intention is to reach a deal where there'll be an implementation period. But yeah, we want to change our immigration system so that it is based not on which country you come from, but what you bring to the country.
Doesn't sound like we've got a new system by March, though, does it?
Well, the intention is to have a deal so that we will have an implementation period, and then at the end of that, at the end of the implementation period, we've got the
David,
time
you'll
to
only
put
get
in
a
place
deal
the
if you
migration
know what
position.
you want. And
We
at the
don't-
moment,
well,
the Cabinet doesn't know what it wants.
Well, look, the politicians here all seem gobsmacked by the numbers on that wall, that so many people seem to agree with the idea of living and working in each other's countries across Europe. Pam Connolly, are you surprised by that?
Not at all. From the reading that I've done recently, it comes as no surprise, because I think both Remainers and Leavers have a certain degree of sympathy and compassion and willingness for freedom of movement.
Simon Bradley, where are you? Simon, what do you think?
Well, we voted to leave the European Union, and that was one of the reasons why I voted to leave. So,
what, freedom of movement?
Yeah, and I think we should still leave, and that needs to be part of it. Stop the freedom of movement.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, what about those trade figures? I mean, people clearly want to be able to set their own trade deals. Isn't that incompatible with staying in the customs union, David Gork, which is what your fallback is looking like?
Well, no, it's not. And our objective, our intention is to be able to enter into trade deals, just as that question suggests. So we need to have the ability to do that. We also need to ensure that we don't put up trade barriers with the European Union, that we have frictionless trade, and that is something which is a key objective of our negotiations.
But if we stay in the customs union, we are not free to do trade deals, are we?
Well, no, our intention is not to stay in the customs union. Our intention is to leave the customs union.
When?
There's an issue, well, as soon as we are able to do so, with having sorted out the Northern Ireland border. And that is our objective. And that's what's happening now with the negotiations, so we can deal with that issue and then go on and enter into trade agreements with other parts of the world.
Barry Gardner, you're no better off here, are you?
Well, look, what we've said is that we believe there should be a customs union, and actually we were saying that a long time ago, and the government's now trying to catch up with its customs arrangement.
Extremely unattractive.
No, that was the Turkish option. Read it properly.
You said customs union is extremely unattractive.
What we've said is that we would want a new customs union. The problem for David and the Conservatives is that they've locked themselves into the existing customs union arrangements in the transition period at least, and then in perpetuity until they sort out the Northern Ireland question. What we've said is we want a new customs union in which the UK would have a say in any new deals that were done. That would mean, just like they do in Mercosur and other customs unions around the world. So we would not be a rule taker, and that's the way that our proposal respects the referendum result, respects the fact that people have said they want to take back control, and that's the difference. And we say that that should be in perpetuity because it sorts out the just-in-time supply chain.
Let me bring
all of our jobs, and particularly the jobs in Sunderland that you mentioned, depend on.
Let me bring
because
in
in the
Nina
automotive industry, it's absolutely critical.
Who has advised European governments on Brexit policy. Does this make sense? Will Europe go for this, where we have a customs deal with the European Union and we're allowed to do our own deals?
As far as the EU's position is concerned, it's quite clear that does not fly. If the UK is in the customs union, or a customs union, it's simply semantics. The UK cannot have its own independent trade policy if it is in the EU's customs union. The problem, of course, is it's not clear how to solve the quandary that's been dogging everyone in these negotiations of the Irish border without either there being a border in the Irish Sea or the entire UK remaining in the customs union, at least for a short period of time.
Well, the really interesting thing about this poll was how much support there was for Theresa May's position on this idea of checks on goods. Let's have a look at that graphic. All political parties in the public seem united in not wanting special checks on goods. If you ask them whether they want goods checks across the Irish Sea, there we are, 45% disagree. Why is the European Union, Nina Schick, still sticking to this?
It's not a question of EU intransigence, it's simply a question of the rules. Now, the UK has said, we're leaving the customs union and we're leaving the single market. So the EU has to have checks on its external border. That happens to be on the island of Ireland. Now, everyone, Ireland, the EU, the UK, agrees that there can be no checks, there are no border. So where do you put the border, given that the technology to have a frictionless border does not yet exist? The EU has said, we'll put it in the Irish Sea. The British government says that is not permissible. Any British government cannot accept that. So therefore, the only conclusion that I see that's viable, and I think the EU's position is clear on this right now, is that the entire UK remains in the customs union, at least for a period until the technology is developed to square this circle.
John, what can you tell us about the public's red lines?
Well, I think what we've learned from this is that how you describe the red lines can make a very big difference to the answer you get. So on Ireland, we were talking about should there be checks. That doesn't sound very nice. On trade, we talked about being limitations on what the UK can do. That doesn't sound very nice. On the other hand, when it came to freedom of movement, we said, well, look, should people be able to free to go and live in each other's countries? And people said, okay, that sounds fine. I think the crucial lesson, therefore, by a lot of these red lines is that particularly when the deal is done, assuming there is a deal, how it gets sold and how it gets described could well be crucial. And I think those on both sides of the fence will need to think hard about whether or not the red lines on which the UK government have insisted are necessarily ones on which the public insist, or whether they are ones where the public can be persuaded to accept them so long as they are presented in an attractive light.
Right. How do we all think Theresa May has handled these negotiations? Sean, how do you think she's done?
Pretty badly.
Why?
Because there's too much uncertainty and we don't know what to do. Businesses do not.
That's not her fault, is it?
Well, the reality is, if you set the clock ticking and enter into negotiation where you have a weaker hand, how is it going to go well? Of course it's not going to go well. And the reality is, for businesses like me, you know, my customers are in the EU, my supply chain is in the EU, and I have EU-based competitors selling the same product. If there's any chance of a border, customs delays, tariffs, I'm going to be uncompetitive, and they're going to steal my business, and I will cease to exist.
Rhys, what do you make of the way Theresa May has handled this?
I mean, I think she's in the rock and a hard place. Yes, she's made bad decisions by going in with the DUP. Obviously, that has politicised the Irish question. But I think we need to ask a larger question. If Theresa May was a man, I think she would not getting as much stick as she's getting right now. I think she gets a lot of stick for being a female. I think the problem is that her cabinet are split between Leave and Remain. She has to be in between that. She has to deal with the DUP. She is probably, although I'm not a Conservative, she is trying her best, I would say, in most regards.
Molly, you were saying rubbish.
Well, Theresa May should be accorded the respect of being judged equally. Whether you're a man or a woman in that role, you have a duty to deliver the Leave vote. The red lines are very clear. It was, we want to be able to be regulatorily diverge from the European Union. Chequers doesn't allow that. We want to have control of the immigration policy. Chequers does not appear to allow that. We will still have ECJ oversight. It's very disrespectful, and the euphemistic language in Chequers is very problematic because it creates distrust. It does what people have been mistrustful of all along. With Maastricht, with Lisbon, it was only the consequences of those things became clear 5 years, 10 years down the line.
Okay, well, we did ask... We did ask what you make of other people who could negotiate this deal. So when it came to Jeremy Corbyn, only 24% thought he would do better than the Prime Minister, and 45% said he'd do worse. The darling of the hardline Tory Brexiteers, Boris Johnson, well, he does even worse. Look at that. 22% saying better, 46% worse. And, well, he's over there, Nigel Farage, the consistent voice of Brexit. Only 23% think Nigel would have done a better job, and 48% think it would do worse. Well, not much confidence in you, Nigel.
Well, I tell you what, there'd be no confusion, because what we're getting here is a Remainers Brexit. Theresa May never believed in it. She's watered it down, delayed it. She's prepared to pay over vast sums of money. The Labour Party are no better. I mean, you know, Barry, you talked about Brexit meaning leaving the customs union, leaving the single market. Well, you've changed your tune on that. And I think the biggest problem we've got here is a lack of leadership. People are very confused out there in the country. If you ask in your questions...
Well, but all these great leaders, everyone talks about Boris Johnson being a great leader. Well, nobody wants him.
Well, I'm not sure anyone knows what to think right now. If you ask people, do you want to make your own laws? Do you want to control your own borders? Do you want to make your own trade deals? You get big majorities saying yes. So in its heart, the country still wants Brexit. I'm afraid it's becoming very disenchanted with politics and politicians.
Caroline Lucas.
I think what these votes show you is the fact that we are now discovering just how complex and costly Brexit is going to be in a way we didn't know 2 years ago. And when it comes to the issue of trade, there is no trade deal in the world that will replace what we already have with the EU. That's 44% of our trade is with the EU now, plus another 17% if you add in all of those countries, another 65 countries with whom the EU has trade deals. The idea that having new trade deals with Australia or India or Indonesia or the US could possibly substitute for that is completely wrong. We know that we would lose around 5% of our growth if we came out of the single market and replaced it with only 0.7% by those other trade deals.
Our survey tells us something quite alarming about the state of British politics, in that people don't agree with Theresa May's deal, and they think all the options are awful as well.
Well, I agree with you. There is something wrong with our politics, which is why we need to go back to the people so that they have a say. But in the meantime, I think we need to be listening to what that survey told us about things like freedom of movement as well. I think that the people now have seen through the kind of rhetoric from Nigel and others who told us that the problem to all of our, the problem behind all of our issues was to do with migration. We now know that public services are crumbling because of a lack of investment from successive governments, and they are not going to be stopped from getting into the NHS by a migrant. You're far more likely to find a migrant treating you in the NHS than you are to find them in front of you.
Well, now remember, Channel 4 has conducted the largest independent survey on Brexit since the referendum. It's given us a fascinating insight into the different camps of supporters. According to the data, the people with the highest chance of voting Leave are currently retired men over the age of 75 who live in the east of England. The people with the highest chance of voting Remain are young black women, particularly students who live in London. But what about the population at large? How would we vote in a referendum today? We will reveal all after the break. Thank you. Thank you.